The Inn of the Two Witches. A Find. Joseph Conrad. This tale, episode, experience, call it how you will, was related in the 50s of the last century by a man who, by his own confession, was 60 years old at the time. 60 is not a bad age, unless in perspective, when no doubt it is contemplated by the majority of us with mixed feelings. It is a calm age. The game is practically over by then, and standing aside, one begins to remember with a certain vividness what a fine fellow one used to be. I have observed that, by an amiable attention of Providence, most people at 60 begin to take a romantic view of themselves. Their very failures exhale a charm of peculiar potency. And indeed, the hopes of the future are a fine company to live with, exquisite forms, fascinating if you like, but, so to speak, naked, stripped for a run. The robes of glamour are luckily the property of the immovable past, which, without them, would sit, a shivery sort of thing, under the gathering shadows. I suppose it was the romanticism of growing age which set our man to relate his experience for his own satisfaction or for the wonder of his posterity. It could not have been for his glory, because the experience was simply that of an abominable fright. Terror, he calls it. You would have guessed that the relation alluded to in the very first lines was in writing. This writing constitutes the find declared in the subtitle. The title itself is my own contrivance, can't call it invention, and has the merit of veracity. We will be concerned with an inn here. As to the witches, that's merely a conventional expression, and we must take our man's word for it that it fits the case. The find was made in a box of books bought in London, in a street which no longer exists, from a second-hand bookseller in the last stage of decay. As to the books themselves, they were at least 20th hand, and on inspection turned out not worth the very small sum of money I disbursed. It might have been some premonition of that fact which made me say, "But I must have the box too." The decayed bookseller assented by the careless, tragic gesture of a man already doomed to extinction. A litter of loose pages at the bottom of the box excited my curiosity, but faintly. The close, neat, regular handwriting was not attractive at first sight, but in one place, the statement that in AD 1813 the writer was 22 years old caught my eye. 22 is an interesting age in which one is easily reckless and easily frightened, the faculty of reflection being weak and the power of imagination strong. In another place, the phrase, "At night we stood in again," arrested my languid attention because it was a sea phrase. Let's see what it is all about, I thought, without excitement. Oh, but it was a dull-faced MS, each line resembling every other line in their close-set and regular order. It was like the drone of a monotonous voice, a treatise on sugar refining, the dreariest subject I can think of, could have been given a more lively appearance. In AD 1813, I was 22 years old, he begins earnestly, and goes on with every appearance of calm, horrible industry. Don't imagine, however, that there is anything archaic in my find. Diabolic ingenuity in invention, though as old as the world is by no means a lost art. Look at the telephones for shattering the little peace of mind given to us in this world, or at the machine guns for letting with dispatch life out of our bodies. Nowadays, any Blair-eyed old witch, if only strong enough to turn an insignificant little handle, could lay low 100 young men of 20 in the twinkling of an eye. If this isn't progress, why immense? We have moved on, and so you must expect to meet here a certain naiveness of contrivance and simplicity of aim appertaining to the remote epoch. And of course, no motoring tourist can hope to find such an inn anywhere now. This one, the one of the title, was situated in Spain. That much I discovered only from internal evidence, because a good many pages of that relation were missing. Perhaps not a great misfortune after all. The writer seemed to have entered into a most elaborate detail of the why and wherefore of his presence on that coast, presumably the north coast of Spain. His experience has nothing to do with the sea, though. As far as I can make it out, he was an officer on board a sloop of war. There's nothing strange in that. At all stages of the long Peninsula campaign, many of our men of war of the smaller kind were cruising off the north coast of Spain, as risky and disagreeable a station as can be well imagined. It looks as though that ship of his had had some special service to perform. A careful explanation of all the circumstances was to be expected from our man, only, as I've said, some of his pages, good tough paper too, were missing, gone in covers for jampos or in wadding for the fowling pieces of his irreverent posterity. But it is to be seen clearly that communication with the shore and even the sending of messengers inland was part of her service, either to obtain intelligence from or to transmit orders or advice to patriotic Spaniards, guerrilleros, or secret juntas of the province. Something of the sort. All this can be only inferred from the preserved scraps of his conscientious writing. Next, we come upon the panegyric of a very fine sailor, a member of the ship's company, having the rating of the captain's coxswain. He was known on board as Cuba Tom, not because he was Cuban, however. He was indeed the best type of a genuine British tar of that time, and a man-of-war's man for years. He came by the name on account of some wonderful adventures he had in that island in his young days, adventures which were the favourite subject of the yarns he was in the habit of spinning to his shipmates of an evening on the forecastle head. He was intelligent, very strong, and of proved courage. Incidentally, we are told, so exact is our narrator, that Tom had the finest pigtail for thickness and length of any man in the navy. This appendage, much cared for and sheathed tightly in a pauper's skin, hung halfway down his broad back to the great admiration of all beholders, and to the great envy of some. Our young officer dwells on the manly qualities of Cuba Tom with something like affection. This sort of relation between officer and man was not then very rare. A youngster, on joining the service, was put under the charge of a trustworthy seaman, who slung his first hammock for him, and often later on became a sort of humble friend to the junior officer. The narrator, on joining the sloop, had found this man on board after some years of separation. There is something touching in the warm pleasure he remembers and records at this meeting with the professional mentor of his boyhood. We discover then that, no Spaniard being forthcoming for the service, this worthy seaman with the unique pigtail and a very high character for courage and steadiness had been selected as messenger for one of these missions inland which have been mentioned. His preparations were not elaborate. One gloomy autumn morning, the sloop ran close to a shallow cove where a landing could be made on that iron-bound shore. A boat was lowered and pulled in with Tom Corbin, Cuba Tom, perched in the bow, and our young man, Mr. Edgar Byrne was his name on this earth which knows him no more, sitting in the stern sheets. A few inhabitants of a hamlet, whose grey stone houses could be seen 100 yards or so up a deep ravine, had come down to the shore and watched the approach of the boat. The two Englishmen leaped ashore. Either from dullness or astonishment, the peasants gave no greeting, and only fell back in silence. Mr. Byrne had made up his mind to see Tom Corbin started fairly on his way. He looked round at the heavy, surprised faces. "There isn't much to get out of them," he said. "Let us walk up to the village. There will be a wine shop for sure, where we may find somebody more promising to talk to and get some information from." "Aye, aye, sir," said Tom, falling into step behind his officer. "A bit of palaver as to courses and distances can do no harm. I crossed the broadest part of Cuba by the help of my tongue, though knowing far less Spanish than I do now. As they say themselves, it was 4 words and no more with me, that time when I got left behind on shore by the Blanche frigate." He made light of what was before him, which was but a day's journey into the mountains. It is true that there was a full day's journey before striking the mountain path, but that was nothing for a man who had crossed the island of Cuba on his 2 legs, and with no more than 4 words of the language to begin with. The officer and the man were walking now on a thick, sodden bed of dead leaves, which the peasants thereabouts accumulate in the streets of their villages to rot during the winter for field manure. Turning his head, Mr. Byrne perceived that the whole male population of the hamlet was following them on the noiseless, springy carpet. Women stared from the doors of the houses, and the children had apparently gone into hiding. The village knew the ship by sight, afar off, but no stranger had landed on that spot perhaps for 100 years or more. The cocked hat of Mr. Byrne, the bushy whiskers, and the enormous pigtail of the sailor filled them with mute wonder. They pressed behind the two Englishmen, staring like those islanders discovered by Captain Cook in the South Seas. It was then that Byrne had his first glimpse of the little cloaked man in a yellow hat. Faded and dingy as it was, this covering for his head made him noticeable. The entrance to the wine shop was like a rough hole in a wall of flints. The owner was the only person who was not in the street, for he came out from the darkness at the back where the inflated forms of wineskins hung on nails could be vaguely distinguished. He was a tall, one-eyed Asturian with scrubby, hollow cheeks. A grave expression of countenance contrasted enigmatically with the roaming restlessness of his solitary eye. On learning that the matter in hand was the sending on his way of that English mariner toward a certain Gonzales in the mountains, he closed his good eye for a moment, as if in meditation, then opened it, very lively again. Possibly. It could be done. A friendly murmur arose in the group in the doorway at the name of Gonzales, the local leader against the French. Inquiring as to the safety of the road, Byrne was glad to learn that no troops of that nation had been seen in the neighborhood for months, not the smallest little detachment of these impious polyzones. While giving these answers, the owner of the wine shop busied himself in drawing into an earthenware jug some wine which he set before the heretic English, pocketing with grave abstraction the small piece of money the officer threw upon the table in recognition of the unwritten law that none may enter a wine shop without buying drink. His eye was in constant motion as if it were trying to do the work of the two, but when Byrne made inquiries as to the possibility of hiring a mule, it became immovably fixed in the direction of the door, which was closely besieged by the curious. In front of them, just within the threshold, the little man in the large cloak and yellow hat had taken his stand. He was a diminutive person, a mere homunculus, Byrne describes him, in a ridiculously mysterious yet assertive attitude, a corner of his cloak thrown cavalierly over his left shoulder, muffling his chin and mouth, while the broad-brimmed yellow hat hung on a corner of his square little head. He stood there taking snuff repeatedly. "A mule," repeated the wine seller, his eyes fixed on that quaint and snuffy figure. "No, Senor Officer, decidedly no mule is to be got in this poor place." The coxswain, who stood by with the true sailor's air of unconcern in strange surroundings, struck in quietly. "If your honor will believe me, Shank's pony's the best for this job. I would have to leave the beast somewhere, anyhow, since the captain has told me that half my way will be along paths fit only for goats." The diminutive man made a step forward, and speaking through the folds of the cloak, which seemed to muffle a sarcastic intention. "Sai, senor, they are too honest in this village to have a single mule amongst them for your worship's service. To that I can bear testimony. In these times it's only rogues or very clever men who can manage to have mules or any other four-footed beasts and the wherewithal to keep them. But what this valiant mariner wants is a guide. And here, senor, behold my brother-in-law, Bernardino, wine seller, and alcalde of this most Christian and hospitable village, who will find you one." This, Mr. Byrne says in his relation, was the only thing to do. A youth in a ragged coat and goatskin breeches was produced after some more talk. The English officer stood treat to the whole village, and while the peasants drank, he and Cuba Tom took their departure accompanied by the guide. The diminutive man in the cloak had disappeared. Byrne went along with the coxswain out of the village. He wanted to see him fairly on his way, and he would have gone a greater distance if the seaman had not suggested respectfully the advisability of return so as not to keep the ship a moment longer than necessary, so close in with the shore on such an unpromising-looking morning. A wild, gloomy sky hung over their heads when they took leave of each other, and their surroundings of rank bushes and stony fields were dreary. In 4 days' time, were Burns' last words. The ship will stand in and send a boat on shore if the weather permits. If not, you'll have to make it out on shore the best you can till we come along to take you off. Right you are, sir, answered Tom, and strode on. Byrne watched him step out on a narrow path. In a thick pea-jacket with a pair of pistols in his belt, a cutlass by his side, and a stout cudgel in his hand, he looked a sturdy figure and well able to take care of himself. He turned round for a moment to wave his hand, giving to Byrne one more view of his honest bronzed face with bushy whiskers. The lad in goatskin breeches looking, Byrne says, like a fawn or a young satyr leaping ahead, stopped to wait for him, and then went off at a bound. Both disappeared. Byrne turned back. The hamlet was hidden in a fold of the ground, and the spot seemed the most lonely corner of the earth, and as if accursed in its uninhabited, desolate barrenness. Before he had walked many yards, there appeared very suddenly from behind a bush the muffled-up, diminutive Spaniard. Naturally, Byrne stopped short. The other made a mysterious gesture with a tiny hand peeping from under his cloak. His hat hung very much at the side of his head. "Senor," he said without any preliminaries, "caution. It is a positive fact that one-eyed Bernardino, my brother-in-law, has at this moment a mule in his stable. And why he who is not clever has a mule there? Because he is a rogue, a man without conscience. Because I had to give up the macho to him to secure for myself a roof to sleep under and a mouthful of olla to keep my soul in this insignificant body of mine. Yet, senor, it contains a heart many times bigger than the mean thing which beats in the breast of that brute connection of mine, of which I am ashamed, though I opposed that marriage with all my power. Well, the misguided woman suffered enough. She had her purgatory on this earth. God rest her soul." Byrne says he was so astonished by the sudden appearance of that sprite-like being, and by the sardonic bitterness of the speech, that he was unable to disentangle the significant fact from what seemed but a piece of family history fired out at him without rhyme or reason. Not at first. He was confounded, and at the same time he was impressed by the rapid, forcible delivery, quite different from the frothy, excited loquacity of an Italian. So he stared while the homunculus, letting his cloak fall about him, aspired an immense quantity of snuff out of the hollow of his palm. "A mule!" exclaimed Byrne, seizing at last the real aspect of the discourse. "You say he has got a mule. That's queer. Why did he refuse to let me have it?" The diminutive Spaniard muffled himself up again with great dignity. "Quien sabe?" he said coldly, with a shrug of his draped shoulders. "He is a great politico in everything he does. But one thing your worship may be certain of, that his intentions are always rascally. This husband of my defunta sister ought to have been married a long time ago to the widow with the wooden legs." "Eh, I see. But remember that, whatever your motives, your worship countenanced him in this lie." The bright, unhappy eyes on each side of a predatory nose confronted Byrne without wincing, while with that testiness which lurks so often at the bottom of Spanish dignity. "No doubt the senior officer would not lose an ounce of blood if I were stuck under the fifth rib," he retorted. "But what of this poor sinner here?" Then, changing his tone, "Senor, by the necessities of the times I live here in exile, a Castilian and an old Christian, existing miserably in the midst of these brute Asturians, and dependent on the worst of them all, who has less conscience and scruples than a wolf. And being a man of intelligence, I govern myself accordingly, yet I can hardly contain my scorn. You have heard the way I spoke. A caballero of parts like your worship might have guessed that there was a cat in there." "What cat?" said Byrne uneasily. "Oh, I see. Something suspicious." "No, senor, I guessed nothing. My nation are not good guessers at that sort of thing, and therefore I ask you plainly whether that wine-seller has spoken the truth in other particulars." "There are certainly no Frenchmen anywhere about," said the little man with a return to his indifferent manner. "Or robbers, ladrones. Ladrones en grande. No, assuredly not," was the answer in a cold, philosophical tone. What is there left for them to do after the French? And nobody travels in these times. But who can say? Opportunity makes the robber. Still, that mariner of yours has a fierce aspect, and with the son of a cat-rats will have no play. But there is a saying, too, that where honey is, there will soon be flies. This oracular discourse exasperated Byrne. "In the name of God," he cried, "tell me plainly if you think my man is reasonably safe on his journey." The homunculus, undergoing one of his rapid changes, seized the officer's arm. The grip of his little hand was astonishing. "Senor," Bernardino had taken notice of him. "What more do you want? And listen, men have disappeared on this road, on a certain portion of this road, when Bernardino kept a maison, an inn, and I, his brother-in-law, had coaches and mules for hire. Now there are no travellers, no coaches. The French have ruined me. Bernardino has retired here for reasons of his own after my sister died. They were three to torment the life out of her, he and Erminia and Lucilla, two aunts of his, all affiliated to the devil. And now he has robbed me of my last mule. You are an armed man. Demand the macho from him with a pistol to his head, senor. It is not his, I tell you, and ride after your man who is so precious to you. And then you shall both be safe, for no two travellers have been ever known to disappear together in these days. As to the beast, I, its owner, I confide it to your honour." They were staring hard at each other, and Byrne nearly burst into a laugh at the ingenuity and transparency of the little man's plot to regain possession of his mule. But he had no difficulty to keep a straight face, because he felt deep within himself a strange inclination to do that very extraordinary thing. He did not laugh, but his lip quivered, at which the diminutive Spaniard, detaching his black, glittering eyes from Byrne's face, turned his back on him brusquely with a gesture and a fling of the cloak, which somehow expressed contempt, bitterness, and discouragement all at once. He turned away and stood still, his hat aslant, muffled up to the ears. But he was not offended to the point of refusing the silver duro which Byrne offered him with a non-committal speech, as if nothing extraordinary had passed between them. "I must make haste on board now," said Byrne then. "Vaya usted con Dios," muttered the gnome. And this interview ended with a sarcastic low sweep of the hat, which was replaced at the same perilous angle as before. Directly the boat had been hoisted, the ship's sails were filled on the offshore tack, and Byrne imparted the whole story to his captain, who was but a very few years older than himself. There was some amused indignation at it, but while they laughed, they looked gravely at each other. A Spanish dwarf trying to beguile an officer of His Majesty's Navy into stealing a mule for him. That was too funny, too ridiculous, too incredible. Those were the exclamations of the captain. He couldn't get over the grotesqueness of it. "Incredible! That's just it," murmured Byrne at last in a significant tone. They exchanged a long stare. "It's as clear as daylight," affirmed the captain impatiently, because in his heart he was not certain. And Tom, the best seaman in the ship for one, the good-humouredly deferential friend of his boyhood for the other, was becoming endowed with a compelling fascination, like a symbolic figure of loyalty appealing to their feelings and their conscience, so that they could not detach their thoughts from his safety. Several times they went up on deck, only to look at the coast, as if it could tell them something of his fate. It stretched away, lengthening in the distance, mute, naked, and savage, veiled now and then by the slanting cold shafts of rain. The westerly swell rolled its interminable angry lines of foam, and big dark clouds flew over the ship in a sinister procession. "I wish to goodness you had done what your little friend in the yellow hat wanted you to do," said the commander of the sloop, late in the afternoon, with visible exasperation. "Do you, sir?" answered Byrne, bitter with positive anguish. "I wonder what you would have said afterwards. Why? I might have been kicked out of the service for looting a mule from a nation in alliance with His Majesty, or I might have been battered to a pulp with flails and pitchforks, a pretty tale to get abroad about one of your officers, while trying to steal a mule. or chased ignominiously to the boat, for you would not have expected me to shoot down unoffending people for the sake of a mangy mule. And yet, he added in a low voice, I almost wish myself I had done it. Before dark, those two young men had worked themselves up into a highly complex psychological state of scornful skepticism and alarmed credulity. It tormented them exceedingly, and the thought that it would have to last for 6 days at least, and possibly be prolonged further for an indefinite time, was not to be borne. The ship was therefore put on the inshore tack at dark. All through the gusty, dark night, she went towards the land to look for her man, at times lying over in the heavy puffs, at others rolling idle in the swell, nearly stationary, as if she too had a mind of her own to swing perplexed between cool reason and warm impulse. Then, just at daybreak, a boat put off from her and went on, tossed by the seas towards the shallow cove, where, with considerable difficulty, an officer in a thick coat and a round hat managed to land on a strip of shingle. It was my wish, writes Mr. Byrne, a wish of which my captain approved, to land secretly if possible. I did not want to be seen either by my aggrieved friend in the yellow hat, whose motives were not clear, or by the one-eyed wine seller, who may or may not have been affiliated to the devil, or indeed by any other dweller in that primitive village. But unfortunately, the cove was the only possible landing place for miles, and from the steepness of the ravine I couldn't make a circuit to avoid the houses. Fortunately, he goes on, all the people were yet in their beds. It was barely daylight when I found myself walking on the thick layer of sodden leaves filling the only street. No soul was stirring abroad, no dog barked. The silence was profound, and I had concluded with some wonder that apparently no dogs were kept in the hamlet when I heard a low snarl, and from a noisome alley between two hovels emerged a vile cur with its tail between its legs. He slunk off silently, showing me his teeth as he ran before me, and he disappeared so suddenly that he might have been the unclean incarnation of the evil one. There was, too, something so weird in the manner of its coming and vanishing that my spirits, already by no means very high, became further depressed by the revolting sight of this creature, as if by an unlucky presage. He got away from the coast unobserved as far as he knew, then struggled manfully to the west against wind and rain, on a barren, dark upland, under a sky of ashes. Far away, the harsh and desolate mountains, raising their scarped and denuded ridges, seemed to wait for him menacingly. The evening found him fairly near to them, but, in sailor language, uncertain of his position, hungry, wet, and tired out by a day of steady tramping over broken ground, during which he had seen very few people and had been unable to obtain the slightest intelligence of Tom Corbin's passage. On, on, I must push on, he had been saying to himself through the hours of solitary effort, spurred more by incertitude than by any definite fear or definite hope. The lowering daylight died out quickly, leaving him faced by a broken bridge. He descended into the ravine, forded a narrow stream by the last gleam of rapid water, and clambering out on the other side was met by the night, which fell like a bandage over his eyes. The wind, sweeping in the darkness, the broadside of the Sierra worried his ears by a continuous roaring noise, as of a maddened sea. He suspected that he had lost the road. Even in daylight, with its ruts and mud holes and ledges of outcropping stone, it was difficult to distinguish from the dreary waste of the moor, interspersed with boulders and clumps of naked bushes. But, as he says, he steered his course by the feel of the wind. His hat rammed low on his brow, his head down, stopping now and again from mere weariness of mind rather than of body, as if not his strength, but his resolution were being overtaxed by the strain of endeavour half suspected to be vain, and by the unrest of his feelings. In one of these pauses, borne in the wind faintly, as if from very far away, he heard a sound of knocking, just knocking on wood. He noticed that the wind had lulled suddenly. His heart started beating tumultuously, because in himself he carried the impression of the desert solitudes he had been traversing for the last 6 hours. the oppressive sense of an uninhabited world. When he raised his head, a gleam of light, illusory as it often happens in dense darkness, swam before his eyes. While he peered, the sound of feeble knocking was repeated, and suddenly he felt rather than saw the existence of a massive obstacle in his path. What was it? The spur of a hill? Or was it a house? Yes, it was a house right close, as though it had risen from the ground or had come gliding to meet him, dumb and pallid, from some dark recess of the night. It towered loftily. He had come up under its lee, another 3 steps, and he could have touched the wall with his hand. It was no doubt a posada, and some other traveller was trying for admittance. He heard again the sound of cautious knocking. Next moment, a broad band of light fell into the night through the open door. Burns stepped eagerly into it, whereupon the person outside leaped with a stifled cry away into the night. An exclamation of surprise was heard, too, from within. Byrne, flinging himself against the half-closed door, forced his way in against some considerable resistance. A miserable candle, a mere rushlight, burned at the end of a long deal table. And in its light, Byrne saw, staggering yet, the girl he had driven from the door. She had a short black skirt, an orange shawl, a dark complexion, and the escaped single hairs from the mass, sombre and thick like a forest, and held up by a comb, made a black mist about her low forehead. A shrill, lamentable howl of "Misericordia" came in 2 voices from the further end of the long room, where the firelight of an open hearth played between heavy shadows. The girl, recovering herself, drew a hissing breath through her set teeth. It is unnecessary to report the long process of questions and answers by which he soothed the fears of 2 old women who sat on each side of the fire, on which stood a large earthenware pot. Byrne thought at once of 2 witches watching the brewing of some deadly potion. But all the same, when one of them, raising forward painfully her broken form, lifted the cover of the pot, the escaping steam had an appetizing smell. The other did not budge, but sat hunched up, her head trembling all the time. They were horrible. There was something grotesque in their decrepitude, their toothless mouths, their hooked noses, the meagreness of the active one, and the hanging yellow cheeks of the other, the still one whose head trembled, would have been laughable if the sight of their dreadful physical degradation had not been appalling to one's eyes, had not gripped one's heart with poignant amazement at the unspeakable misery of age, at the awful persistency of life becoming at last an object of disgust and dread. To get over it, Byrne began to talk, saying that he was an Englishman and that he was in search of a countryman who ought to have passed this way. Directly he had spoken, the recollection of his parting with Tom came up in his mind with amazing vividness. The silent villagers, the angry gnome, the one-eyed wine-seller, Bernardino. Why, these 2 unspeakable frights must be that man's aunts, affiliated to the devil. Whatever they had been, once it was impossible to imagine what use such feeble creatures could be to the devil now in the world of the living. Which was Lucilla, and which was Erminia? They were now things without a name. A moment of suspended animation followed Byrne's words. The sorceress with the spoon ceased stirring the mess in the iron pot. The very trembling of the other's head stopped for the space of breath. In this infinitesimal fraction of a second, Byrne had the sense of being really on his quest, of having reached the turn of the path, almost within hail of Tom. They have seen him, he thought with conviction. Here was at last somebody who had seen him. He made sure they would deny all knowledge of the Ingalls, but on the contrary, they were eager to tell him that he had eaten and slept the night in the house. They both started talking together, describing his appearance and behavior. An excitement quite fierce in its feebleness possessed them. The doubled-up sorceress flourished aloft her wooden spoon. The puffy monster got off her stool and screeched, stepping from one foot to the other, while the trembling of her head was accelerated to positive vibration. Byrne was quite disconcerted by their excited behavior. Yes! The big, fierce Ingalls went away in the morning, after eating a piece of bread and drinking some wine. and if the caballero wished to follow the same path, nothing could be easier in the morning. "You will give me somebody to show me the way," said Byrne. "Sai, senor, a proper youth, the man the caballero saw going out." "But he was knocking at the door," protested Byrne. "He only bolted when he saw me. He was coming in." "No, no!" the two horrid witches screamed out together. "Going out! Going out!" After all, it may have been true. The sound of knocking had been faint, elusive, reflected Byrne. Perhaps only the effect of his fancy. He asked, "Who is that man?" "Her novio," they screamed, pointing to the girl. "He has gone home to a village far away from here, but he will return in the morning. Her novio, and she is an orphan, the child of poor Christian people. She lives with us for the love of God, for the love of God." The orphan crouching on the corner of the hearth had been looking at Byrne. He thought that she was more like a child of Satan kept there by these two weird harridans for the love of the devil. Her eyes were a little oblique, her mouth rather thick, but admirably formed. Her dark face had a wild beauty, voluptuous and untamed. As to the character of her steadfast gaze attached upon him with a sensuously savage attention. "To know what it was like," says Mr. Byrne, "you have only to observe a hungry cat watching a bird in a cage or a mouse inside a trap. It was she who served him the food, of which he was glad, though with those big, slanting black eyes examining him at close range, as if he had something curious written on his face, she gave him an uncomfortable sensation. But anything was better than being approached by these blear-eyed, nightmarish witches. His apprehensions somehow had been soothed, perhaps by the sensation of warmth after severe exposure and the ease of resting after the exertion of fighting the gale inch by inch all the way. He had no doubt of Tom's safety. He was now sleeping in the mountain camp, having been met by Gonzales's men. Byrne rose, filled a tin goblet with wine out of a skin hanging on the wall, and sat down again. The witch with the mummy face began to talk to him, ramblingly of old times. She boasted of the inn's fame in those better days. Great people in their own coaches stopped there. An archbishop slept once in the casa, a long, long time ago. The witch with the puffy face seemed to be listening from her stool, motionless, except for the trembling of her head. The girl, Byrne was certain she was a casual gypsy admitted there for some reason or other, sat on the hearthstone in the glow of the embers. She hummed a tune to herself, rattling a pair of castanets slightly now and then. At the mention of the archbishop, she chuckled impiously and turned her head to look at Byrne, so that the red glow of the fire flashed in her black eyes and on her white teeth under the dark cowl of the enormous overmantle. And he smiled at her. He rested now in the ease of security. His advent not having been expected, there could be no plot against him in existence. Drowsiness stole upon his senses. He enjoyed it, but keeping a hold, so he thought at least, on his wits. But he must have been gone further than he thought, because he was startled beyond measure by a fiendish uproar. He had never heard anything so pitilessly strident in his life. The witches had started a fierce quarrel about something or other. Whatever its origin, they were now only abusing each other violently, without arguments. Their senile screams expressed nothing but wicked anger and ferocious dismay. The gypsy girl's black eyes flew from one to the other. Never before had Byrne felt himself so removed from fellowship with human beings. Before he had really time to understand the subject of the quarrel, the girl jumped up, rattling her castanets loudly. A silence fell. She came up to the table and bending over, her eyes in his. "Signor," she said with decision, "you shall sleep in the archbishop's room." Neither of the witches objected. The dried-up one, bent double, was propped on a stick. The puffy-faced one had now a crutch. Byrne got up, walked to the door, and turning the key in the enormous lock, put it coolly in his pocket. This was clearly the only entrance, and he did not mean to be taken unawares by whatever danger there might have been lurking outside. When he turned from the door, he saw the two witches, affiliated to the devil, and the satanic girl looking at him in silence. He wondered if Tom Corbin took the same precaution last night. And thinking of him, he had again that queer impression of his nearness. The world was perfectly dumb. And in this stillness, he heard the blood beating in his ears with a confused rushing noise in which there seemed to be a voice uttering the words, "Mr. Byrne, look out, sir." Tom's voice. He shuddered, for the delusions of the senses of hearing are the most vivid of all, and from their nature have a compelling character. It seemed impossible that Tom should not be there. Again, a slight chill as of stealthy draught penetrated through his very clothes and passed over all his body. He shook off the impression with an effort. It was the girl who preceded him upstairs, carrying an iron lamp from the naked flame of which ascended a thin thread of smoke. Her soiled white stockings were full of holes. With the same quiet resolution with which he had locked the door below, Byrne threw open one after another the doors in the corridor. All the rooms were empty, except for some nondescript lumber in one or two, and the girl, seeing what he would be at, stopped every time, raising the smoky light in each doorway patiently. Meantime, she observed him with sustained attention. The last door of all she threw open herself. "You sleep here, senor," she murmured in a voice light like a child's breath, offering him the lamp. "Buenos noches, señorita," he said politely, taking it from her. She didn't return the wish audibly, though her lips did move a little, while her gaze, black like a starless night, never for a moment wavered before him. He stepped in, and as he turned to close the door, she was still there, motionless and disturbing, with her voluptuous mouth and slanting eyes, with the expression of expectant sensual ferocity of a baffled cat. He hesitated for a moment, and in the dumb house he heard again the blood pulsating ponderously in his ears, while once more the illusion of Tom's voice speaking earnestly somewhere nearby was specially terrifying, because this time he could not make out the words. He slammed the door in the girl's face at last, leaving her in the dark, and he opened it again almost on the instant. Nobody. She had vanished without the slightest sound. He closed the door quickly and bolted it with two heavy bolts. A profound mistrust possessed him suddenly. Why did the witches quarrel about letting him sleep here? And what meant that stare of the girl, as if she wanted to impress his features forever in her mind? His own nervousness alarmed him. He seemed to himself to be removed very far from mankind. He examined his room. It was not very high, just high enough to take the bed which stood under an enormous baldaquin-like canopy from which fell heavy curtains at foot and head, a bed certainly worthy of an archbishop. There was a heavy table carved all round the edges, some armchairs of enormous weight, like the spoils of a grandee's palace, a tall, shallow wardrobe placed against the wall and with double doors. He tried them. Locked. A suspicion came into his mind, and he snatched the lamp to make a closer examination. No, it was not a disguised entrance. That heavy, tall piece of furniture stood clear of the wall by quite an inch. He glanced at the bolts of his room door. No, no one could get at him treacherously while he slept. But would he be able to sleep? He asked himself anxiously. If only he had Tom there, the trusty seaman who had fought at his right hand in a cutting-out affair or two, and had always preached to him the necessity to take care of himself. For it's no great trick, he used to say, to get yourself killed in a hot fight. Any fool can do that. The proper pastime is to fight the Frenchies and then live to fight another day. Byrne found it a hard matter not to fall into listening to the silence. Somehow he had the conviction that nothing would break it unless he heard again the haunting sound of Tom's voice. He had heard it twice before. Odd. And yet no wonder, he argued with himself reasonably, since he had been thinking of the man for over 30 hours continuously, and what's more, inconclusively. For his anxiety for Tom had never taken a definite shape. Disappear was the only word connected with the idea of Tom's danger. It was very vague and awful. Disappear! What did that mean? Byrne shuddered, and then said to himself that he must be a little feverish. But Tom had not disappeared. Byrne had just heard of him. And again the young man felt the blood beating in his ears. He sat still, expecting every moment to hear through the pulsating strokes the sound of Tom's voice. He waited, straining his ears, but nothing came. Suddenly the thought occurred to him. He has not disappeared, but he cannot make himself heard. He jumped up from the armchair. How absurd! Laying his pistol and his hanger on the table, he took off his boots and, feeling suddenly too tired to stand, flung himself on the bed, which he found soft and comfortable beyond his hopes. He had felt very wakeful, but he must have dozed off after all, because the next thing he knew he was sitting up in bed and trying to recollect what it was that Tom's voice had said. Oh, he remembered it now. It had said, "Mr. Byrne, look out, sir." A warning, this. But against what? He landed with one leap in the middle of the floor, gasped once, then looked all round the room. The window was shuttered and barred with an iron bar. Again he ran his eyes slowly all round the bare walls, and even looked up at the ceiling, which was rather high. Afterwards he went to the door to examine the fastenings. They consisted of two enormous iron bolts sliding into holes made in the wall, and as the corridor outside was too narrow to admit of any battering arrangement or even to permit an axe to be swung, nothing could burst the door open, unless gunpowder. But while he was still making sure that the lower bolt was pushed well home, he received the impression of somebody's presence in the room. It was so strong that he spun round quicker than lightning. There was no one. Who could there be? And yet, it was then that he lost the decorum and restraint a man keeps up for his own sake. He got down on his hands and knees with the lamp on the floor to look under the bed, like a silly girl. He saw a lot of dust and nothing else. He got up, his cheeks burning, and walked about discontented with his own behaviour and unreasonably angry with Tom for not leaving him alone. The words, "Mr. Byrne, look out, sir," kept on repeating themselves in his head in a tone of warning. Hadn't I better just throw myself on the bed and try to go to sleep? He asked himself. But his eyes fell on the tall wardrobe, and he went towards it, feeling irritated with himself, and yet unable to desist. How he could explain tomorrow the burglarious misdeed to the two odious witches he had no idea. Nevertheless, he inserted the point of his hanger between the two halves of the door and tried to prise them open. They resisted. He swore, sticking now hotly to his purpose. His mutter, "I hope you will be satisfied. Confound you," was addressed to the absent Tom. Just then the doors gave way and flew open. He was there. He, the trusty, sagacious, and courageous Tom, was there, drawn up shadowy and stiff, in a prudent silence, which his wide-open eyes, by their fixed gleam, seemed to command Byrne to respect. But Byrne was too startled to make a sound. Amazed, he stepped back a little, and on the instant the seaman flung himself forward headlong as if to clasp his officer round the neck. Instinctively, Byrne put out his faltering arms. He felt the horrible rigidity of the body, and then the coldness of death as their heads knocked together and their faces came into contact. They reeled, Byrne hugging Tom close to his breast in order not to let him fall with a crash. He had just strength enough to lower the awful burden gently to the floor. Then his head swam, his legs gave way, and he sank on his knees, leaning over the body with his hands resting on the breast of that man, once full of generous life, and now as insensible as a stone. "Dead! My poor Tom, dead!" he repeated mentally. The light of the lamp standing near the edge of the table fell from above straight on the stony, empty stare of these eyes, which naturally had a mobile and merry expression. Byrne turned his own away from them. Tom's black silk neckerchief was not knotted on his breast. It was gone. The murderers had also taken off his shoes and stockings, and noticing this spoliation, the exposed throat, the bare upturned feet, Byrne felt his eyes run full of tears. In other respects, the seaman was fully dressed, neither was his clothing disarranged as it must have been in a violent struggle. Only his checked shirt had been pulled a little out the waistband in one place, just enough to ascertain whether he had a money belt fastened round his body. Byrne began to sob into his handkerchief. It was a nervous outburst which passed off quickly. Remaining on his knees, he contemplated sadly the athletic body of as fine a seaman as ever had drawn a cutlass, laid a gun, or passed the weather earring in a gale, lying stiff and cold, his cheery, fearless spirit departed, perhaps turning to him, his boy-chum, to his ship out there rolling on the grey seas off an iron-bound coast at the very moment of its flight. He perceived that the 6 brass buttons of Tom's jacket had been cut off. He shuddered at the notion of the 2 miserable and repulsive witches busying themselves ghoulishly about the defenceless body of his friend. Cut off, perhaps with the same knife which... The head of one trembled. The other was bent double, and their eyes were red and bleared, their infamous claws unsteady. It must have been in this very room, too, for Tom could not have been killed in the open and brought in here afterwards. Of that, Byrne was certain. Yet those devilish crones could not have killed him themselves even by taking him unawares, and Tom would be always on his guard, of course. Tom was a very wide-awake, wary man when engaged on any service, and in fact, how did they murder him? Who did? In what way? Byrne jumped up, snatched the lamp off the table, and stooped swiftly over the body. The light revealed on the clothing no stain, no trace, no spot of blood anywhere. Byrne's hands began to shake so that he had to set the lamp on the floor and turn away his head in order to recover from this agitation. Then he began to explore that cold, still, and rigid body for a stab, a gunshot wound, for the trace of some killing blow. He felt all over the skull anxiously. It was whole. He slipped his hand under the neck. It was unbroken. With terrified eyes, he peered close under the chin and saw no marks of strangulation on the throat. There were no signs anywhere. He was just dead. Impulsively, Byrne got away from the body, as if the mystery of an incomprehensible death had changed his pity into suspicion and dread. The lamp on the floor near the set, still face of the seaman, showed it staring at the ceiling as if despairingly. In the circle of light, Byrne saw by the undisturbed patches of thick dust on the floor that there had been no struggle in that room. He has died outside, he thought. Yes, outside in that narrow corridor, where there was hardly room to turn, the mysterious death had come to his poor dear Tom. The impulse of snatching up his pistols and rushing out of the room abandoned Byrne suddenly. For Tom, too, had been armed, with just such powerless weapons as he himself possessed, pistols, a cutlass, and Tom had died a nameless death by incomprehensible means. A new thought came to Byrne. That stranger knocking at the door and fleeing so swiftly at his appearance had come there to remove the body. Aha! That was the guide the withered witch had promised would show the English officer the shortest way of rejoining his man. A promise, he saw it now, of dreadful import. He who had knocked would have 2 bodies to deal with. Man and officer would go forth from the house together, for Byrne was certain now that he would have to die before the morning, and in the same mysterious manner, leaving behind him an unmarked body. The sight of a smashed head, of a throat cut, of a gaping gunshot wound would have been an inexpressible relief. It would have soothed all his fears. His soul cried within him to that dead man whom he had never found wanting in danger. "Why don't you tell me what I am to look for, Tom? Why don't you?" But in rigid immobility, extended on his back, he seemed to preserve an austere silence, as if disdaining in the finality of his awful knowledge to hold converse with the living. Suddenly, Byrne flung himself on his knees by the side of the body, and dry-eyed, fierce, opened the shirt wide on the breast, as if to tear the secret forcibly from that cold heart which had been so loyal to him in life. Nothing, nothing. He raised the lamp, and all the sign vouchsafed to him by that face which used to be so kindly in expression was a small bruise on the forehead, the least thing, a mere mark. The skin, even, was not broken. He stared at it a long time as if lost in a dreadful dream. Then he observed that Tom's hands were clenched, as though he had fallen facing somebody in a fight with fists. His knuckles, on closer view, appeared somewhat abraded. Both hands. The discovery of these slight signs was more appalling to Byrne than the absolute absence of every mark would have been. So Tom had died striking against something which could be hit, and yet could kill one without leaving a wound, by a breath. Terror, hot terror, began to play about Byrne's heart like a tongue of flame that touches and withdraws before it turns a thing to ashes. He backed away from the body as far as he could, then came forward stealthily, casting fearful glances to steal another look at the bruised forehead. There would perhaps be such a faint bruise on his own forehead before the morning. "I can't bear it," he whispered to himself. Tom was for him now an object of horror, a sight at once tempting and revolting to his fear. He couldn't bear to look at him. At last, desperation getting the better of his increasing horror, he stepped forward from the wall against which he had been leaning, seized the corpse under the armpits, and began to lug it over to the bed. The bare heels of the seaman trailed on the floor noiselessly. He was heavy with the dead weight of inanimate objects. With a last effort, Byrne landed him face downwards on the edge of the bed, rolled him over, snatched from under this stiff, passive thing a sheet with which he covered it over. Then he spread the curtains at head and foot, so that, joining together as he shook their folds, they hid the bed altogether from his sight. He stumbled towards a chair and fell on it. The perspiration poured from his face for a moment, and then his veins seemed to carry for a while a thin stream of half-frozen blood. Complete terror had possession of him now, a nameless terror which had turned his heart to ashes. He sat upright in the straight-backed chair, the lamp burning at his feet, his pistols and his hanger at his left elbow on the end of the table, his eyes turning incessantly in their sockets round the walls, over the ceiling, over the floor, in the expectation of a mysterious and appalling vision. The thing which could deal death in a breath was outside that bolted door. But Byrne believed neither in walls nor bolts now. Unreasoning terror turning everything to account, his old-time boyish admiration of the athletic Tom, the undaunted Tom, he had seemed to him invincible, helped to paralyze his faculties, added to his despair. He was no longer Edgar Byrne. He was a tortured soul suffering more anguish than any sinner's body had ever suffered from rack or boot. The depth of his torment may be measured when I say that this young man, as brave at least as the average of his kind, contemplated seizing a pistol and firing into his own head, but a deadly, chilly languor was spreading over his limbs. It was as if his flesh had been wet plaster, stiffening slowly about his ribs. Presently, he thought, the two witches will be coming in, with crutch and stick, horrible, grotesque, monstrous, affiliated to the devil, to put a mark on his forehead, the tiny little bruise of death. And he wouldn't be able to do anything. Tom had struck out at something, but he was not like Tom. His limbs were dead already. He sat still, dying the death over and over again, and the only part of him which moved were his eyes, turning round and round in their sockets, running over the walls, the floor, the ceiling, again and again, till suddenly they became motionless and stony, starting out of his head, fixed in the direction of the bed. He had seen the heavy curtains stir and shake, as if the dead body they concealed had turned over and sat up. Byrne, who thought the world could hold no more terrors in store, felt his hair stir at the roots. He gripped the arms of the chair, his jaw fell, and the sweat broke out on his brow, while his dry tongue clove suddenly to the roof of his mouth. Again the curtain stirred, but did not open. "Don't, Tom!" Byrne made effort to shout, but all he heard was a slight moan, such as an uneasy sleeper may make. He felt that his brain was going, for now it seemed to him that the ceiling over the bed had moved, had slanted, and came level again, and once more the closed curtains swayed gently as if about to part. Byrne closed his eyes, not to see the awful apparition of the seaman's corpse coming out animated by an evil spirit. In the profound silence of the room, he endured a moment of frightful agony, then opened his eyes again, and he saw at once that the curtains remained closed still, but that the ceiling over the bed had risen quite a foot. With the last gleam of reason left to him, he understood that it was the enormous baldaquin over the bed which was coming down, while the curtains attached to it swayed softly, sinking gradually to the floor. His drooping jaw snapped to, and half rising in his chair, he watched mutely the noiseless descent of the monstrous canopy. It came down in short, smooth rushes till lowered halfway or more, when it took a run and settled swiftly its turtle-back shape, with the deep border piece fitting exactly the edge of the bedstead. A slight crack or two of wood were heard, and the overpowering stillness of the room resumed its sway. Burns stood up, gasped for breath, and let out a cry of rage and dismay, the first sound which he is perfectly certain did make its way past his lips on this night of terrors. This, then, was the death he had escaped. This was the devilish artifice of murder poor Tom's soul had perhaps tried from beyond the border to warn him of, for this was how he had died. Byrne was certain he had heard the voice of the seaman, faintly distinct in his familiar phrase, "Mr. Byrne, look out, sir," and again uttering words he could not make out. But then the distance separating the living from the dead is so great. Poor Tom had tried. Byrne ran to the bed and attempted to lift up, to push off the horrible lid smothering the body. It resisted his efforts, heavy as lead, immovable like a tombstone. The rage of vengeance made him desist. His head buzzed with chaotic thoughts of extermination. He turned round the room as if he could find neither his weapons nor the way out, and all the time he stammered awful menaces. A violent battering at the door of the inn recalled him to his soberer senses. He flew to the window, pulled the shutters open, and looked out. In the faint dawn, he saw below him a mob of men. Ha! He would go and face at once this murderous lot, collected no doubt for his undoing. After his struggle with nameless terrors, he yearned for an open fray with armed enemies. But he must have remained yet bereft of his reason, because forgetting his weapons, he rushed downstairs with a wild cry, unbarred the door while blows were raining on it outside, and flinging it open, flew with his bare hands at the throat of the first man he saw before him. They rolled over together. Byrne's hazy intention was to break through, to fly up the mountain path, and come back presently with Gonzales's men to exact an exemplary vengeance. He fought furiously, till a tree, a house, a mountain seemed to crash down upon his head, and he knew no more. Here Mr. Byrne describes in detail the skilful manner in which he found his broken head bandaged, informs us that he had lost a great deal of blood, and ascribes the preservation of his sanity to that circumstance. He sets down Gonzales' profuse apologies in full, too, for it was Gonzales who, tired of waiting for news from the English, had come down to the inn with half his band on his way to the sea. His Excellency, he explained, rushed out with fierce impetuosity, and moreover was not known to us for a friend, and so we, etc., etc. When asked what had become of the witches, he only pointed his finger silently to the ground, then voiced calmly a moral reflection. "The passion for gold is pitiless in the very old, Seigneur," he said. "No doubt in former days they have put many a solitary traveller to sleep in the archbishop's bed." "There was also a gypsy girl there," said Byrne feebly from the improvised litter on which he was being carried to the coast by a squad of guerrilleros. "It was she who winched up that infernal machine, and it was she too who lowered it that night," was the answer. "But why? Why?" exclaimed Byrne. "Why should she wish for my death?" "No doubt for the sake of your Excellency's coat buttons," said politely the saturnine Gonzales. "We found those of the dead mariner concealed on her person, but your Excellency may rest assured that everything that is fitting has been done on this occasion." Byrne asked no more questions. There was still another death which was considered by Gonzales as fitting to the occasion. The one-eyed Bernardino stuck against the wall of his wine shop received the charge of 6 escopetas into his breast. As the shots rang out, the rough bier with Tom's body on it went past, carried by a bandit-like gang of Spanish patriots, down the ravine to the shore, where 2 boats from the ship were waiting for what was left on earth of her best seamen. Mr. Byrne, very pale and weak, stepped into the boat which carried the body of his humble friend, for it was decided that Tom Corbin should rest far out in the Bay of Biscay. The officer took the tiller, and turning his head for the last look at the shore, saw on the grey hillside something moving, which he made out to be a little man in a yellow hat mounted on a mule, that mule without which the fate of Tom Corbin would have remained mysterious forever.
All right, everyone's presentations are done. Nick, the manager, said as he tried to move the discussion forward. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me and began to speak. There's apparently someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. His lackey, Mike, of course, agreed with Nick. I'm leaving. After leaving the meeting room, I started to shut down my computer. I noticed that an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking, there's no point in speaking up, no one will listen, I went home quietly. The next day, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. He was staring at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick! Is something wrong? Mike looked at the screen with him. And he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Knowing the reason for Mike's distress, I thought to myself, serves them right. My name is Adam. My mother passed away when I was in the 9th grade, and I was raised by my father. Well, you could hardly call it being raised. After my mother passed, my father changed. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and though he still went to work, he squandered our living expenses on horse racing. Because of that, I had to start working part-time as soon as I entered high school. Every month, I went to the convenience store with bills in hand that couldn't be auto-deducted from my father's account. Even though I endured it because I didn't want to be alone, I reached my limit in my 2nd year of high school and dropped out. I found a live-in job at a distant inn. Thank you for everything. The day I left home, my father, still staring at the TV, spoke. Take care. That was our last conversation. Back then, 18 wasn't the age of majority, so I needed my father's permission to work, and I couldn't hide my place of employment. Yet, my father never visited me even once. I kept working just to survive, and before I knew it, I was 42. Years of hard work paid off, and I was transferred to the headquarters. I was thrilled to be recognized by the company, as I thought I'd be working in the field until retirement due to my lack of formal education. Listen up. Our work can change the future of our employees. Don't drag us down. On my first day after the transfer, Nick, dressed in an expensive suit, spoke sternly. There was a reason for this. Our inn was located in a prominent tourist destination, known so well that everyone in the state could sing its commercial jingle. At its peak, we had 5 locations within the state. But that was long ago. Due to financial difficulties and aging facilities, only the place where I had worked for many years and the original establishment remained. I was prepared to lose my job anytime, but now there was a glimmer of hope. With the rise of social media, the tourist area where the inn was located started gaining attention again. Depending on how hard the sales department, where I was transferred, worked, we could either thrive or be forced to give up this prime location to the new hotel chains continuously popping up. For Nick, who had switched careers from another industry to strengthen our sales, this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. I understood why he had to be strict. I will do my best. Nick sneered at my enthusiastic declaration. Did you not hear what I said? I'm sorry. I thought I was listening carefully. Out of habit from years of customer service, I apologized reflexively, though I had no idea what had offended him. Someone was watching me with a smirk. In this department, there are those who are expected to excel and those who have been shoved here because they have nowhere else to go. You are the latter. It was Mike, the section chief. He's 7 years younger, at 35. But he was called to headquarters much earlier than I was and had been moving around within the headquarters ever since. I'm not jealous, but I can't accept that he's my boss. Graduating from a prestigious university, he has an unusually high pride and caused many problems as a newbie, making things very difficult for me when I was the front desk leader. When I found out Mike was transferred to the sales department a month before me, I was disheartened. Mike is right. With just a middle school diploma, there's not much you can do. Don't even think about achieving results. As if I didn't exist, Nick remarked, I'm thirsty. Mike eagerly ran to the coffee maker. It seems Mike is Nick's lackey. I regretted being happy about my transfer to headquarters, wishing I had stayed on site forever. Send a direct mail to every company on this list by the end of the day. Nick only assigned me tasks that even a new graduate could handle. What? There are over 1,000 companies. You want me to send to all of them by today? Yes, if you and your fellow misfits split the work, even those with nowhere else to go should finish by today. I glanced at the employees typing away expressionlessly. They were worn out from customer service, only thinking about leaving on time, or were women reassigned after having children, with zero motivation for work. Even Sam, a new graduate from the same university as Mike, who was supposed to be among the expected achievers, had no enthusiasm for the job, having joined the company wanting to do customer service. I don't care what they say, I plan to quit anytime, he said. Only Nick and Mike were highly motivated, making all the decisions between the two of them. I originally only wanted to work at the Inn to survive and had no particular attachment to this job. I swallowed my words, thinking I had no right to reprimand them. About a month after the transfer, Nick told us with a frustrated look. To commemorate the 50th anniversary, we've decided to create a plan exclusive for one group per day. Originally, Mike and I were supposed to come up with it, but our president, Mr. Thompson, insists on hearing everyone's opinions. So, you all get a chance. As Nick explained, Mike began handing out prints. Make sure not to embarrass Nick. If your ideas are half-baked, you'll have to redo them. It seemed that they had printed his handwritten notes by Mr. Thompson, which included several questions and a section for free responses. It made sense why Nick had to seek our input, given that all responses had to be submitted to Mr. Thompson. We were given a week to think about it, and a meeting was scheduled to compile our ideas. My plan is to let guests enjoy both the old and modern America. Nick began the presentations. Guests would watch a master confectioner at a nearby traditional sweet shop make sweets in front of them. The welcome drink would be premium tea in a bottle. Nick's plan was certainly attractive. After his presentation, Nick called on us to present in the order we were seated. Just as I stood up for my turn. All right, everyone's presentations are done. Excuse me, I haven't. I recently found out something. Nick interrupted me. There's someone in this department who didn't graduate high school and is just a part-timer. He was likely talking about me. I joined the company as a part-timer and was made a full-time employee when I turned 20. That was 20 years ago, so Nick and Mike probably had no chance to know until recently. Meetings should be for employees only. Absolutely right. After that, Nick kept creating opportunities to solicit everyone's opinions, purposefully excluding me from speaking. The meeting unexpectedly heated up and went past the scheduled end time. A few people asked to leave, and the discussion continued with the remaining few. Still here? Normally, you'd leave in that situation. Though I had no attachment to the job initially, hearing kind words from customers made me want to make them happier. For someone like me, with nowhere to go, the Inn was my home and customer service was my life. I felt pathetic about my current self. I'm leaving. I left the conference room and started shutting down my computer. I noticed an email had arrived, not in my personal inbox, but in the company's shared email. Thinking no one would listen to what I had to say anyway, I quietly went home. The next day, while preparing the DM as instructed, I heard a commotion from Nick's desk. In his haste to stand up, he hit his knee on the desk. He stared at his computer screen, his face pale. Nick! What's wrong? Mike, thinking he should be the first to rush over, approached Nick while still wearing his coat. He peered at the screen with Nick. and he turned even paler than Nick. Why is he so angry? Who is responsible for this company? Nick, more irritated than ever, asked, and Mike answered without checking. Probably Sam. Sam wasn't there because he was attending a morning training session for new hires. Nick gave up on getting angry and returned his gaze to the screen. They were looking at an email that arrived right after the end of the working day yesterday. Apparently, no one, including me, had checked it before leaving. The email was from a large company that used us for their annual employee trips. The president and executives of that company also frequently used our services personally. President of the company, Mr. Mason himself, had declared that neither he nor his company would ever use our services again. Well, some companies cancel their employee trips or stop using our services due to financial struggles. Let's just move on. Mike kept wiping the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. Knowing why Mike was so agitated, I quietly watched their interaction. Do you know how much revenue we get from that company? We can find other guests to fill the rooms, but we'll lose the banquet costs, gift shop revenue, rental car fees, and more. Moreover, the gifts were supposed to be prepared by the traditional confectionery shop involved in Nick's proposed plan. If it's known that we incurred such a huge loss at this critical time, Nick's position in the company would be jeopardized. Nick took a deep breath, seemingly trying to calm himself. All right, Mike. Go to New York right now and apologize to Mr. Mason. What? You're coming with me, right? I have urgent work to do. I trust you, which is why I'm entrusting this to you. Please. Mike, believing Nick's sincerity, agreed with a determined look on his face, saying, yes. That's Nick for you. Even if Mike went to apologize, Nick would shift all the blame onto him if the client didn't change their mind. Well, it was Mike's fault to begin with, so it served him right. About 3 hours later, Sam answered a call from somewhere and repeatedly apologized, saying, I'm very sorry. Everyone watched to see what was happening. After ending the call, he informed Nick with a weary tone. When Mike arrived at the client's company, he only made things worse, further infuriating Mr. Mason. He was demanding, get his boss here immediately. It was no wonder Sam was exhausted, dealing with such a call right after returning from training. What is that idiot doing? All right, Adam, you're coming with me. If sacrificing Mike didn't work, then I must be next. Normally, I'd want to refuse at all costs, but I saw an opportunity in this situation. If I can be of assistance, I'd be happy to join you. I immediately followed Nick, and we flew to New York. When we introduced ourselves at the reception, it became clear how serious the situation was. As the receptionist personally escorted us to the president's office. Angry voices leaked through the door, making both Nick and me uneasy. Excuse me. I'm Nick, the supervisor. I understand my subordinate has caused you trouble, and I deeply apologize. Nick, with his experience in the corporate world, knew enough to offer an apology before excuses. However, his customer service skills left much to be desired. I sighed as I saw Mike trembling like a small dog in the corner of the room. What kind of training are you giving your subordinates? Mr. Mason glared at Nick with a red face. The intensity of his gaze made even Nick take a step back. Regrettably, I joined this company only 2 years ago and was unaware of Mike's issues. I should have identified his shortcomings sooner. Indeed. I should have realized sooner. No sensible person would come to apologize and then give a lengthy presentation on the drawbacks of not using their inn. Nick froze, his mouth slightly open. Suspecting the worst, I picked up the documents that had fallen to the floor. It seemed Mike hastily prepared these documents on the plane, listing the disadvantages. Disadvantage 1: if you change the venue for the company trip, employees might suspect it's for cost-cutting reasons, leading to a negative impression. Reading it aloud half-jokingly, Nick snatched the papers from my hand and checked the contents with a furious expression. Among the stack of documents was a receipt from a nearby convenience store's copy machine. I felt a pang of dread, hoping he hadn't shown the receipt as well. What do you think he said when I asked what kind of nerve he had to do this? I'm very sorry. Faced with the dire situation, Nick must have thought there was nothing left to do but apologize. In a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he uttered words of apology. He said, I'm a Harvard graduate. I don't believe I said anything wrong. Mike! What have you done? Forgetting his plan to pin the blame on Mike, Nick yelled loudly, even in front of Mr. Mason. I didn't do anything wrong. You're still saying that? Look at him. Mike pointed at me with a shaking hand. I was assigned to headquarters in my 20s and now I'm a section chief. This guy only made it to headquarters at 42. Everything I've done proves I was right. So why are we losing the contract? Having said his piece, Mike collapsed to the floor. Of course. You were sent there because you had nowhere else to go. Mike never expected to hear such words from someone he looked down upon. He lunged at me, and Nick hurriedly stepped in to stop him. Mr. Thompson told me Mike is a quick thinker, and to take good care of him. There's no way he was pushed aside. Don't make things worse here. He didn't say quick thinker, he said only quick-witted, didn't he? I don't remember that part. I recalled the many troubles Mike caused when he was a newbie. When Mike was on the front line, his pride was so high that he never apologized to customers. Customer service, especially in our job, doesn't work alone. It brings both good and bad situations. If the front staff or housekeepers made mistakes, or the cleaning company didn't properly clean a room, one had to apologize to the customers regardless of personal fault. Mike, in such situations, would never apologize, insisting he wasn't at fault. This often angered customers, and as the front desk leader, I frequently had to apologize on his behalf. He caused complaints and disrupted operations, which is why he was quickly moved to headquarters. In departments where he didn't interact directly with customers, his quick thinking was beneficial and things went well. But it seemed his flaws were starting to show. Corporate reservations are supposed to be entered into the system by the sales representative. But a quick check yesterday revealed that more than 10 items were missing from the client's reservation. The handover document clearly stated what needed to be prepared. Why didn't you enter it into the system? Why do we have to give them special treatment? Filling rooms near the banquet hall, setting up all the food in advance. Specifying the brand of wine, they're too demanding. No wonder he always angered customers, I thought, feeling a headache coming on. Grouping them in rooms near the banquet hall is for our benefit too. It makes it easier for the staff to set up beds and serve breakfast since everyone's schedule is synchronized. As for the other requests, Mr. Mason suggested them to lighten our load. I didn't know that. Nick finally seemed to realize that Mike was the one who had angered the client. What did you say to them? I just told them we wouldn't give them special treatment anymore. We shouldn't waste effort on things that don't bring in money. I was utterly exasperated at his lack of understanding of customer service. Of course, we shouldn't comply with unreasonable demands. But carrying over successful practices from past stays makes customers feel remembered and enhances their experience. Good memories encourage repeat visits. That's part of our job. I looked down at Mike, who was sitting on the floor. In our job, nothing is a waste. Mr. Thompson likely moved you to the sales department, hoping you'd finally understand this. How do you think he feels now that you failed to meet his expectations? Mike, tears in his eyes, fled the president's office. I was amazed he still hadn't apologized. You have it tough, Adam. It's okay, we're all employees of the same company. I deeply apologize for this disrespectful incident. Especially after all the care you've shown us. If it weren't for you, Adam, I really would have stopped staying here. When I heard you were moving to the sales department, I was willing to reconsider if you handled it. Seeing us talk so amicably, Nick's face contorted. Do you two know each other? Adam's service is excellent. I always requested him specifically. Normally, we don't accept specific staff requests, but we made an exception for Mr. Mason, adjusting my shifts accordingly. He had personally stayed at our hotel just before my transfer, and during casual conversation, I mentioned, I'm moving to the sales department soon. If I hadn't told him then, things could have been much worse. Please continue to take care of us. I look forward to it. On the return flight, Nick awkwardly offered me a can of beer. It's still working hours. Of course, I had no intention of forgiving him for a single beer. Nick might try to pin everything on Mike and avoid any consequences. While pondering this, a startling fact came to light. Nick, the tea bottles for the plan have arrived. I handed Nick a bottle labeled with our inn's name. They look good. What are you talking about? These are plastic bottles. I had assumed we would use the trendy, high-end bottling tea. But what arrived were ordinary plastic bottles of tea with customized labels. The only unique aspect was the label, which had the inn's name, making it look customized. Upon further investigation, I discovered that a substantial amount of money was set to be paid to the tea company. It was priced like bottling tea. Does this plastic bottle really cost $100 each? The tea inside is specially blended for us. The extra cost is for that. Wouldn't it be better to use another tea company? Or is there a specific reason we must use this one? As Nick continued to make excuses, I showed him a printed email. I informed the tea company's president, Mr. Mitchell, that we discovered irregular payments and he confessed. He said you two were high school classmates and planned to split the extra money. That idiot. Why did he confess? That's not important. You should worry about yourself, this could turn into a police matter. Opening the bottle cap, I suggested. How about calming down with this tea? It supposedly has a relaxing effect. Nick drank the tea frantically. In the following days, decisions were made about their fates. Mike was reassigned to the General Affairs Department, with no chance of transfer or promotion, as per Mr. Thompson's orders. As for Nick, since the payment to the tea company hadn't yet been made, he narrowly avoided legal trouble. Instead, he was encouraged to leave the company, and to avoid further complications, Nick submitted his resignation. Rumor has it that connections between HR departments have made it difficult for him to find new employment. Even though it was good to have those two gone, something unexpected happened in the sales department. Everyone became motivated and united in refining the 50th anniversary plan. In the end, my plan was adopted. We collaborated with the Tourist Information Center to provide personalized guides. The plan, tailored to the number of guests, was truly special for the 50th anniversary. Hey, is Adam's family coming to stay? I immediately booked that special plan for my family. Sam noticed it on the reservation list and quickly picked up on it. Yes, I'm inviting my father. That's great. I might invite my parents too. I lacked the courage to face my father just as Adam. But here, with the confidence Mr. Mason praised, I felt ready. The 50th anniversary plan was a perfect opportunity to reconnect with my father. I hoped to bring back the days when we could laugh together as we once did.